If it's Thursday, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis could make a move in a matter of days as the aspiring presidential candidate faces a double dose of political problems: Donald Trump and Walt Disney. Plus, accused Pentagon leaker Jack Teixeira appears in court while seeking bail as the Justice Department warns that he still poses a national security risk and could have access to even more classified material if he's released. And slowdowns and showdowns. New data shows the U.S. economy losing steam a bit faster than expected. Why Wall Street thinks that's good news as Washington grapples with a looming debt ceiling crisis. Happy Thursday and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I am Chuck Todd reporting from Washington as a closely watched presidential candidacy is taking shape and taking hits before it gets off the ground. NBC News broke the story last night that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is poised to jump into this race officially for president as soon as the middle of next month. That's according to multiple Republican operatives that are familiar with the timeline. DeSantis is acting like an emerging candidate. He's making moves at home to bolster his conservative credentials and making moves abroad, trying to build some foreign policy credentials. He's in Israel today, where he addressed our NBC reporting about his 2024 plans during a press conference in Jerusalem. Take a listen.
I've been focused on this mission that we've been doing. We're going to end up making it pretty much around the world by the time we're done. And if there's any announcements, those will come at the appropriate time. But it's not, if anyone's telling you that somehow they know this or they know that, that's just inaccurate because there's not been any decisions.
But folks, with a presidential announcement reportedly in the planning stages, DeSantis has been collecting problems, not supporters. His most recent and perhaps most problematic headache comes from one of the state's most powerful employers, Disney. In the latest escalation in an ongoing feud between the company and the governor, Disney yesterday filed a federal lawsuit against DeSantis and other state officials. The lawsuit alleges, quote, a targeted campaign of government retaliation orchestrated at every step by Governor DeSantis as punishment for Disney's protected speech. Over the last year, DeSantis has seemingly tried to damage Disney for the sin of publicly opposing his state's so-called Don't Say Gay education law. Florida
I don't think the suit has merit. I think it's political. I think they filed, in Tallahassee for a reason because they're trying to generate, some district court decision. But we're very confident on the law.
That was Governor DeSantis responding to a question about the lawsuit. Florida has revoked that self-governing status in the area around the theme parks. DeSantis has also threatened to perhaps build a competing theme park. He even stuck his tongue in his cheek, claiming he might even build a prison there. But bottom line is DeSantis eyes a political battle for the Republican nomination. He has, for some reason, picked a fight with a well-funded and popular corporate opponent. All of this comes as he's faced a number of stumbles already. He's losing ground to Donald Trump on multiple fronts. He trails the former president by double digits in our latest NBC News poll. And he's losing coveted Florida endorsements to Donald Trump, 11-1 in his home state. As the saying goes in politics, good gets better and bad gets worse. And right now, DeSantis is in one of those ruts where everything looks worse. He does not appear well positioned to win a fight against Donald Trump or Disney. Gabe Gutierrez is traveling with Governor DeSantis in Jerusalem, covering the trip there. In a moment, I'll be joined by NBC News senior national political reporter Natasha Korecki, and I'll also be joined by defense lawyer and NBC News legal analyst Danny Sabalos to break down the Disney case. But Gabe, let me start with you. You've had some access to Governor DeSantis, more access to Prime Minister Netanyahu, who loves to dabble in Republican politics in this country, though he claims he doesn't. What did you learn, and what's your big takeaway?
Hey there, Chuck. Well, yes, I did manage to get a few questions into Governor DeSantis this morning. And I can tell you, Chuck, this was his element, right? He has been to Israel before. He came as a congressman in 2017, as governor back in 2019. But as you said, it's hard not to look at this trip, this overseas trip, not just to Israel, but he's been to Japan, South Korea. Tomorrow he's going to the UK, widely seen as a trip to bolster his foreign policy credentials. He was greeted as a bit of a rock star today when he walked and delivered that speech. In the news conference afterwards, Chuck, you mentioned that, he may have a political problem here with Disney, of course, but I took it, when he answered my question, he didn't shy away from it. He was almost eager to fire back at Disney today, despite what I pointed out to him, how it looks for a supposedly pro-business Republican governor who's making this overseas trade mission to attract businesses to Florida. And yet the biggest employer in his state right now is calling him anti-business and filing this federal lawsuit. And he is calling it political and without merit. But this seems to be a fight he wants to pick, much to the astonishment of, some Republican political operatives that I've been speaking with that can't really understand it. Of course, he's gotten pushback from other prominent Republicans as well. I did speak with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today, who met with DeSantis this afternoon, and he's walking a very fine line, of course, a staunch ally of the former president, Donald Trump, but he is calling both former President Trump and DeSantis friends of Israel. Take a listen to my exchange right after that meeting. You were fresh off a meeting with Governor Ron DeSantis. What'd you talk about?
Talked about Iran, talked about Israel-U.S. relations. He's a friend of Israel, and Israel has been blessed to have great friends on both sides of the aisle.
What do you make of him on the international stage? Is he someone you could work with if he were to run for president?
Well, we didn't talk about American politics. I have enough politics here, so I've avoided stepping into that field.
So, Chuck, he was very coy right there. But I did notice, I also asked Prime Minister Netanyahu about his reaction to what President Biden had said several weeks ago about the judicial protests here and how President Biden had asked him to walk away from these proposed judicial reforms, I should say. And DeSantis, when I asked him about those judicial reforms today, there was basically no daylight between him and Netanyahu. He was saying that this is, not something that the U.S. should be involved in, that the U.S. should butt out of Israel's internal affairs, of course, trying to strike a contrast between himself and the current president, President Biden. So just very interesting dynamic here, but Netanyahu, of course, walking that fine line, a smooth political operator here, Chuck.
Gabe, what Governor DeSantis is doing is, frankly, something in the pre-Trump era that would have been condemned by every elected official in this country, which is to somehow go overseas and dispute American foreign policy, because it is the American foreign policy on this right now when it comes to Israel. This is not something responsible elected officials normally do. This is a pretty irresponsible thing that he did to do this on the world stage. To politicize this is... Look, it's Israel, and a lot of things Israel get politicized in this country, but it is something that's quite striking.
Certainly. Look, times have changed, certainly, Chuck, as you know. I did notice, and, my interactions in person with Governor DeSantis have been limited. I did notice some sort of restraint here. He didn't actively, as aggressively call out the Biden administration on this overseas trip as he has been known to do before. Still, he was very clear. He was very tough talk on Israel. And of course, there's that larger backdrop that a larger and increasing percentage of Democrats have sympathized over the last several years with Palestinians. And that came up today. Also, my conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So certainly, yes, the governor did implicitly criticize the current Biden administration, didn't do so as forcefully, though, as he would at a press conference in Florida. By the way, I should point out, he did take time out of that press conference today to sign a piece of legislation that his Florida legislature passed just yesterday about anti-hate legislation in Florida. He highlighted that, of course, today, again, to a very friendly audience. All
right. Gabe Gutierrez traveling and covering Governor DeSantis in Israel for us. Gabe, thank you. Let me bring in Natasha Korecki here. So, Natasha, is this another instance, and it's interesting here, is your sense that mid-May was always the plan? Or are they, again, it looks like this is a very reactive operation, not a very proactive operation. And I'm trying to figure this out. Is it truly as reactive as it looks, or are they caught flat-footed and they're trying to get their sea legs here?
I think there's a lot of debate inside of DeSantis' world right now, and that's really what we were getting from our sources yesterday. When there was a push to go May 11th, there was a push to go way later, saying we're not going to be ready by then. So then you're hearing about this exploratory committee that's sort of like, this is a middle ground, so we can kind of dip.
So he's not really going to announce, but he is going to announce, or he wants to kind of have a way to only be 1 foot in?
What our sources are saying. Several of them said he will be in by mid-May. One of the sources did say exploratory first, then a full launch. It gives him a little bit of footing. I think what they're trying to do, yes, it's reactive, but there is a lot of people complaining that he is not reactive enough and not quickly enough on lots of issues. But in this case, that's going to appease a lot of these donors and supporters who are just really apprehensive right now.
Who's in charge of this operation? Because you have this super PAC that has a lot of well-known national people, Jeff Rowe, Ken Cuccinelli. But if they're in the super PAC, they can't really be involved in the day-to-day, at least legally. Susie Wiles, who orchestrated his initial run for governor, is with Donald Trump. Is it just Casey DeSantis and Ron DeSantis making these calls? I mean, who is it that has his ear?
Well, Ron DeSantis and Casey DeSantis, it's always been a very, very tight-knit operation there. And that is kind of what we're hearing right now and what people are saying. That's what we're seeing right now. It's too tight-knit. They're not listening to enough people. They're not doing the kinds of things they need to do politically, calling people back, you know, just basic things like, you know, trying to curry favor with some of these donors, maybe getting them to stay along with him, getting the endorsements from these congressmen and so forth. And a lot of people that we talked to over the last couple of days are saying that's because it is just too insular. It's too tight-knit. It's too in Tallahassee right now.
Is this a case, and we've seen this before, right? Chris Christie won big in 2013, and he thought he was untouchable. Does Bridgegate, his political career is over. Ron DeSantis wins by 20. Clearly, he's got some political acumen here. But is this a case where, you know, he thought, wow, I'm untouchable and I can do anything I want, and they almost have an overzealous view of themselves? Yeah,
and when you hear him lay out his Florida blueprint, which is what he's been doing in the early states, it's a series of, see, I was right. See, I was right. And
but so the Disney fight feels like Bridgegate to me. Like you're picking a fight. Like, why are you doing that?
And that, interestingly enough, used to be part of that blueprint, and then it really got condensed over time.
He doesn't talk the Disney stuff as much, does he?
No, it's just a quick reference. Donors do not like this fight. You know, it was fine in the beginning. Maybe he had something back and forth that seemed like he won. Now it's protracted. It's going on and on. Whether he wins legally or not is irrelevant. Politically, it's a loss for him.
Good politicians know when to declare victory, and he had an opportunity to declare victory over Disney a while ago, and he forgot. Natasha, terrific reporting. It's a fascinating world to try to unpack.
Thank you.
Good work. Let me bring in Danny Savalas. Danny, I'm going to go through a timeline here for you, because I'm curious to see how much merit you think Disney has here. They believe it's political retaliation. March 28, 2022, DeSantis signs the what opponents call the Don't Say Gay bill. Disney criticizes the law in the form of a couple of different ways, but some executives, Bob Iger was one of them when he was a former Disney executive at the time. The current CEO was pressured to speak out. He does it. The very next day, DeSantis warns Disney, I think they crossed the line. The day after that, a GOP state lawmaker floats dissolving Disney's special district as punishment. 20 days later, DeSantis asks the legislature to revoke the special status. They do. And then, of course, before Disney loses its control of their board, they essentially defang the replacement group that's coming. DeSantis appoints his new board. The board vetoes the self-governance agreement. Disney files suit. This timeline alone looks pretty damning to me. What say you?
The real question is this kind of retaliation, which I think Disney can make out pretty clearly, that timeline alone could end up as an exhibit in a trial. But is retaliation by the government against a company, is that even something that is actionable in court? And the challenge here is that Disney is such a unique corporation. It's not just a massive source of revenue for the state of Florida. It also occupies a very unique space in that it has its own self-governing district that we just talked about. So what it constitutes improper targeting in this case? Well, Disney is claiming that this action violates the Constitution's contracts clause. Basically, the state government cannot pass a law that interferes with or destroys contractual obligations of a private entity. But that rule itself has a lot of exceptions. You can imagine all kinds of legislation that affects private contracts and imposes additional burdens on a private entity. But in this case, Disney really does have a case. that it was targeted specifically.
Right.
Now, the defense may argue instead, well, hey, we're just dealing with somebody who has a very unique situation,
right,
and we're dissolving this self-governing entity that they have. It's not targeting because this is such a unique, singular entity.
But it's about motive, right? And how important is it for Disney's case that they can prove motive?
Yeah, that's the challenge here for the defense, the state of Florida and Ron DeSantis, is that how are they possibly going to argue that this was not targeting? I believe DeSantis has arguably admitted as much in public statements that this was a retaliation for a company expressing its thoughts. Now, keep in mind, Disney is also alleging a First Amendment violation, but here's a little trick you can tell to figure out how powerful, how much the plaintiff, Disney in this case, believes in its cause of action. It puts the Contracts Clause violation number one front and center in the complaint. The First Amendment counts are at the end. So Disney must believe much more in the contracts case, and I tend to agree it's their strongest
Very
case.
quickly, Danny, how long, when does discovery begin? Are we looking over the next 6 months, 9 months? Is this about a year? What's the timeline? Because it matters to those of us covering the campaign.
In federal court, the parties are required to have a Rule 26 conference to figure out discovery and talk amongst themselves. If they can't, they go to the court. But that's usually the beginning of discovery. And from there, it can take months, if not years. But you're in federal court, so federal court always moves a lot faster than state court.
So you think this calendar year will have some form of discovery?
Absolutely. Discovery will be started by the end of this calendar year. It may not be completed.
Boy, in the middle of a presidential race, what gets discovered? Danny Savalos, our legal expert, thank you. Coming up, President Biden says the U.S. economy is strong despite new GDP data coming in below expectations. Of course, Wall Street loved that. What it means, why it matters, and how it could impact the Fed's fight against inflation next. Plus, is there a real potential for peace in Ukraine, brokered by China? We're on the ground in Kyiv with the latest. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The Dow, of course, closed up over 500 points today. Why? Because investors were really happy with the bad economic news. Okay. And the good corporate earnings as well. Economic growth was lower than expected in the first quarter, rising just 1.1%, below the expectation of 2% growth. But that might not entirely be a bad thing, since slower growth is what the Federal Reserve has been trying to orchestrate, as it's been hiking borrowing rates in an effort to tame soaring inflation. And despite those rising prices and rising borrowing rates, consumers are still spending. I'm joined now by CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Leisman. You know, Steve, the minute I saw this bad economic news, I was like, well, market's going to love this. And sure enough, they did. Is this a sign that the Fed can now pause its rate increases, at least for a quarter, while they wait to see?
Yeah, I think you're wasting your time anchoring the show here, Todd. You ought to be, Chuck. You ought to be playing, working the computer in the morning at 8:30. Listen, we got a little bit better consumption numbers. The consumer seems to be hanging in there. The inflation numbers were not better. They were actually a little bit worse than expected. It does suggest, given the overall weaker numbers from, say, Q4, that there is some traction to what the Fed is doing. But I don't think it's enough to say the Fed can stop here. They are likely to hike again next quarter, and then I think that next week, and I think there's going to be a debate about whether or not they need to do more. It depends on what happens to the inflation numbers.
These corporate earnings have all been good. Is it they're good because they were so bad a year ago, or are they actually good earnings reports?
There's a little bit of that, but actually companies have found a way to make money, as you know. Even as prices went up, they were able to raise their prices along with it, in some cases higher. They maintained their profit margins. And fundamentally, Chuck, the consumer has not really relaxed very much here. Unemployment is very low. So it is possible here we get out of this without a recession. And I'll give you a little inside, very wonky details. Did you see a big part of why we had this weak number was inventories were weak? if companies can get their inventories in line for slower economic growth, it means we can have perhaps a soft landing. It's when things shock companies and all of a sudden they got a lot of stuff on the shelves they don't need to sell, that they can't sell. That's when you may get a recession. But if we can get things in line with a slower economic growth, we could have slower growth, not necessarily a recession.
Well, I was just going to ask you, what's the likelihood we're going to have a quarter where we'll have negative growth between now and November of 2024?
I think
pick a random date.
I think it's quite. I think it's quite possible because here's the thing. This may be the last whole number in front of a GDP report we get in a while. The expectations that I'm seeing in our surveys are down to 0.5, even negative for the third and fourth quarter, but just slightly negative. So it could be that we do have some negative quarters in the next, from now until the end of the year.
Well, if there are two in a row, right, that's the supposed definition of the R word, which folks in the White House we know are petrified of before November 2024, Steve.
Well, actually, Chuck, it's not exactly the definition of a recession. It's kind of a rule of thumb, and the NBER is the one that determines it.
I get
For example, we had two.
I get it, but
we had two negative quarters
that isn't
last year,
stop
and that
the
was
political.
not a recession.
That's not going to stop the political spinning. You know that.
Well, I do know that, which is precisely why I'm an economics reporter. Don't have to get involved in that stuff.
Good for you. Some days you and I should trade jobs. Steve Leisman, you got to go more reporting for you. I'll let you go. Thank you, brother. And thank you for making us smarter about today's economic news. Up next, Trump on trial and on the trail. You're looking live at New Hampshire, where the former president is holding his first campaign event since his New York arrest, by the way, and Biden's re-election announcement. The latest from the ground next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
Tim Cahill.
Welcome back. The happiest man on earth about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' ongoing fight with the happiest place on earth is probably Donald Trump, who's right now on the campaign trail speaking in New Hampshire. You're looking at live pictures of him right now. He is, if you're wondering, not taking roll call. He's shouting out supporters still, so very early in his remarks. The Trump campaign sent me some excerpts. They sent me the excerpts where he's going to go after Biden, and he's going to go after him hard on the economy, for what it's worth. But Vaughn Hilliard is following the former president in New Hampshire. And one thing, Vaughn, I know you've learned and I've learned is whatever the Trump campaign tells us the president's going to be saying, and the former president's going to be saying in his remarks, is perhaps just a suggestion.
Chuck, you know, you've got to follow those excerpts pretty closely because usually they're not delivered line by line. You know, look, I think it's notable what is in those excerpts, though, and that is him taking on Joe Biden directly, and no mention of DeSantis or any of the other Republican rivals, because here just days after Joe Biden's re-election announcement, he is essentially trying to frame this as a 2020 general election rematch instead of even paying acknowledgement to the other Republican rivals, trying to hone in on the contrast that is his administration versus Joe Biden's.
Do you, the campaign, I know they're gleeful of this DeSantis stuff. I'm curious, how do they talk about DeSantis to the traveling press versus how much they want you talking about Trump?
Right. There is a constant undercutting of the Florida governor at play here, pointing out of clips of him, you know, when he was fumbling in response to the question delivered to him earlier this week about his standing in the polls, making the suggestion that he's not even a candidate yet. But it's clearly for them essentially trying to consolidate the support around them. You see the number of folks, state legislators they have on stage with them. This is a machine that, you know, the campaign points out has been built over 8 years. They have identified over 8 years the individuals who have voted for them in general elections, in primaries, and they're putting pressure on these lawmakers here to get on board now, get on board early. Donald Trump remembers who was there with him on the early days here, and that is where this is sort of a behind-the-scenes effort on the primary stage, knowing that they can try to consolidate that support.
Look, it seems like their whole goal is to make this inevitable that he's going to be the nominee. Is that part of the thinking of not doing the debates?
Right. They don't want to do, I've been told, the August debate, despite the RNC asserting that it will happen in Milwaukee in August. And, you know, when you look at the polling here, University of New Hampshire just released polling that shows a 32-point swing. This is one poll, but a 32-point swing in Donald Trump's favor over the last 4 months. which just hits at the fact. I was talking with one woman, Deb, out in line here, and she told me a couple months ago she was considering DeSantis, but she felt like he had been disloyal in his failed attacks on Donald Trump. I don't know how you're supposed to run against Donald Trump if you don't take him on, but for her, she felt like it was a slight against the former president, somebody who she, by every account, believes the other Republicans should be loyal to, and she said that she's here today, and she is defiantly behind him here ahead of the primary.
That says a lot. It's one anecdote, but it does seem to reinforce a narrative that seems to be developing. Vaughn Hilliard on the ground in New Hampshire. Vaughn, thank you. You know, Yamiche, Joe Biden wants to set this up as a contrast between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Donald Trump wants to set this up as a contrast between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. These two need each other.
It's fascinating, and I think you're right. They do need each other because they want to just focus on, we're already at the top of the ticket. Let's just go after and see if we can change this again, especially if you're Joe Biden and you're having people question your age and having people question whether or not your vice president is capable of doing her job. There are all these different questions for Joe Biden, and really his campaign wants to point out and say, do you really want that guy again? Do you really want somebody who, in his mind, messed up the entire COVID response, who in his mind has said things that are blatantly racist, in his mind, who is someone who has torn apart the country in a lot of ways.
Right.
So this is exactly what they want. And of course, on Donald Trump's side, he is wanting to paint Joe Biden as someone who is unqualified and old and all the other things that he's been saying. So it is very interesting that these two men are just going after each other. And in some ways with Ron DeSantis, I mean, I was talking to some young Republicans yesterday, and they said it was embarrassing in their mind to see him go after Disney, that it went against, in their minds, conservative values when you look at businesses in the free market, which I hadn't heard all that much about before from a conservative point of view in terms of just conservative values and businesses. I got two former congressmen here, Joe Crowley, Rodney Davis, DNR. They're codependents, Rodney. I mean, this is a codependent relationship. That's sort of like the rest of us are like the children of divorced parents go, what the hell's going on here?
You know, I'm going to volunteer Crowley here to be their therapist. They can go in and solve this problem. But you're right. They are dependent on each other. And each of them wants to run against each other.
They're only relevant if the other one's there.
It is.
I don't mean to, I do think that the only one that each can beat is each other.
But right now, I mean, the last time we talked, Ron DeSantis had a very good few months. Ron DeSantis has not performed well when being attacked by Trump. The Trump team has done a great job defining him, moving ahead. However, I will caution President Trump. I was up 32 points on my opponent before he endorsed her, and I still lost. So don't get cocky yet. I'm told, breaking news, the Trump campaign wanted to let us know that he had a new nickname for Joe Biden, and he's borrowing the 2016 nicknames. He was going with Crooked. So he moved from Sleepy to Crooked, which was the same name he had given Hillary Clinton. So one thing about his nicknames, he doesn't really put a lot of thought into them. But anyway, Joe Crowley, look, I get that Biden wants to run against Trump, and Trump wants to run against Biden. I mean, this is not the most uplifting presidential campaign what we're all about to
Well, I certainly think having that difference in terms of age would be distinctive. I think in terms of not having that happen, you have a 78 or 79-year-old. I'm not sure how old Trump is going to be when he runs. Right. It diminishes that factor tremendously. But it's also, Joe Biden is the incumbent. I would argue he's had a very successful 4 years. Maybe not the last two, given the makeup of the House, but the IRA, the American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS Act. There are a lot of bills that he can run on and will run on, I think, positively.
Do you think he's going to run on? He's not running on him in his announcement video. He didn't run on any of that stuff. Well, he's only running against Trump.
I think part of it is still yet to materialize in a lot of those projects, but I think they're going to be there, and I think it's going to be much stronger for him at that point in time. But yeah, look. Trump is a flawed candidate. I think even Republicans will say that. Right. And so, he's going to be dealing with trials. He's going to be dealing with the issue of a rape trial and a civil case up in New York. He's got all these other criminal cases potentially happening. I've seen countries where, vote for the guy in jail. I mean, that was something that works sometimes in what we call banana republics, maybe, but not in the United States.
Yamiche, it's interesting what Joe just brought up. Trump's going to have this trial over here. And he's got this and this and this and all this stuff. But now Ron DeSantis has a Disney trial that is going to be sitting here. And this is a fight, the smart politicians know how to declare victory and walk away. He won this fight. And then he found a way to lose it. It's the strangest. His handling of this frankly, I think has been eye-opening about whether or not you think he can handle the presidency.
Exactly. And I mean, I go back to that conversation I was having with young Republicans. These are millennial Republicans just last night. And they look at this and say, how in the world are you picking a fight with Disney? How in the world are you picking a fight with people who have jobs and with a constituency where people's jobs in Disney are connected to the base that you want to win? And it was another thing that I hadn't thought of. There are 100, I mean, it's in some ways obvious, thousands of jobs in Florida where blue-collar people can go and work for a decent wage, and that is also resonating with Republicans. I do want to say, though, when you go back to sort of this rematch idea, it is interesting that Joe Biden is sort of leading into cultural issues, because we talk so much about Republicans and the culture wars and all of that, but when you talk to Democrats, they're pretty pissed about banned books, about abortion, about what their children can and can't learn about the consequences of slavery. So in some ways, it's I think a realization. The Democrats are saying, wait, our voters are also very mobilized on this. We can also get people to the polls, not only just talking about inflation and the economy and what we've accomplished, but also, do you want to live in a world where Republicans are telling you what you can eat and what you can learn and what you can do with your own body?
Rodney, Brian Ballard calls you up and says, hey, give Ron DeSantis some advice here on this Disney situation. Just on the Disney situation.
On the Disney situation, I think you said it. Take the win. At some point, you got to walk away and figure out how to bring in voters who are not necessarily on the polar ends of the political spectrum. That's the voting bloc that you will need to beat Donald Trump in any Republican primary. He has the polarized voters, and he's gaining those polarized voters as we move forward. However, if Ron's biggest problem, in my opinion, is not Disney right now. It's the fact that because he doesn't have the same personality Donald Trump does, he's not a kind of a grassroots, get-to-know-you, backslapping guy. Trump was really good at that. Ron has lost the endorsements of members of Congress in his home state when he won by the biggest landslide we've seen in a generation.
What kind of relationship do you have with him?
I had a great relationship with him. Ron was a great guy. I didn't have that problem with him.
Were you surprised that Dave Trott felt so passionate about his issues with DeSantis that he was willing to say what he said? And he said, no, put my name on the quote.
I'm not surprised. I know Dave. I like Dave.
Okay.
I like Ron. I'm not surprised.
You might know if he was bit by Goofy as a kid, because what's happening now is absolutely goofy in terms of politics. And if he loses, he loses. And if he wins, he loses. There's no win here at this point in time. Disney World is
he won the bigger fight.
Place.
He won the bigger fight, which is over time.
It's over now.
The state has control of this board.
He's taken it too far. Now he took it too far.
Now he may lose control of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
because if he loses his court fight, then it goes back.
It's politically goofy. People look at it and say, why are we doing this?
You're really pushing this goofy talk.
It's goofy. It is.
You're pretty proud of this goofy thing.
I like this goofy thing.
You don't want to do Pluto. You want to throw a Donald.
I was thinking about Mickey and Minnie, but I said Goofy's better.
I want to talk about this idea that Biden's trying to take the word freedom back from the conservative movement. And I would argue that there is a borderline cancel culture that is showing up on the right that 2 years ago seemed to be an issue. Like, no, we don't want Bud Light. We don't want Disney. You know, there's this line that I wonder, are they going to lose their libertarian wing?
It's an interesting way to sort of commandeer what Republicans have wanted to talk about for the last 2 years, for the president to say, actually, we want to focus on your freedoms and talk about reproductive health, talk about voting rights, talk about civil rights, talk about just your freedom to read which books you want to in your libraries. Right. It's a strategy that I think works for the president, but also in their minds, it's also a strategy that the vice president has been leaning in on as someone who has become the face of their fights on abortion.
Rodney, I feel like you're the type of Republican that wouldn't have enjoyed having the words restrict. You know, that's the thing. It looks like the word restrict is showing up in front of a lot of Republican ideas right now.
Well, a lot of Republicans have seen how successful Democrats have been in pushing cancel culture. When looking at the polarized ends of the political spectrum, once again, that cancel culture, social media cancel culture, has worked in their mind to get Democrats elected. And Donald Trump's brand of republicanism is not the free market. It's a heavy-handed government approach that actually.
So what happens to people like you? What happens to this middle ground? Because I hear this
lost.
I know that. No, where do these voters go? Because they're not comfortable with the progressive left. I understand that, and they don't like this retaliatory right. Well,
suburban America has gone toward the Democrats, and that's a big problem for Republicans. Look, we are the blue-collar party of America right now. The laborers, the carpenters, those who use their hands to build things, they are voting Republican in droves. The problem is, they usually live in areas that aren't as populated in states like mine, And Suburbia's not doing that.
I think the example of the bill that passed yesterday, though, the cuts that are being made in terms of this debt ceiling movement, $500 billion $500 billion in cuts to veterans, cutting student loans, cutting, health care across the board. That's a tough vote, especially for those marginal Republicans right now, speaking to suburban America.
Especially if it's not a real vote. Like, those
That's
are,
right.
right. Nobody likes to vote on something that you don't think is going to become law, right?
Just put America on a path to save $4.8 trillion. That's a great Republican message.
We say that, right. It's just like you don't want to vote for something you know is not going to become law, though.
We do it all the time.
Right.
Joe can tell you that.
Yeah, not no seats in New York, though, Rod. Not no seats in New York.
Interesting.
I was just going to think that when President Trump or former President Trump is going after Ron DeSantis, he's also saying he wants to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and I don't. And I think that's also interesting. It tells you about where the Republican Party is.
And that's just
where Donald Trump's Republican.
Yeah, and it's also DeSantis hasn't figured out how to deal with that yet either. He's got a lot of work to do. Yamiche, Rodney, Joe. Thank you, guys. This was great. After the break, federal prosecutors disclosed some new details behind the accused leaker of Pentagon secrets, warning that if he is out on bail, he could still cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. The latest on that story next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Jack Teixeira, the 21-year-old National Guardsman accused of leaking top-secret Pentagon documents, appeared in court today for a previously postponed detention hearing. Prosecutors are arguing that Teixeira poses a serious flight risk and may still have access to classified information that would be valuable to a foreign adversary. The defense, however, argued Teixeira should be released to his father's custody. The Guardsman has been charged under the Espionage Act with possessing classified documents pertaining to national security and possessing national defense material and could face 25 years in prison. Joining me now for more on this is our Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Kube. Courtney, this idea that they still think if he goes out on bail, they still think he has access to this. Why would he?
We don't know.
How would they not? I'm sorry. Are they that concerned about the vulnerability of their documents?
We don't know. I mean, it's the reality. They don't provide any actual evidence for why they make that claim in these documents.
Okay.
There's two things we do know. According to these documents, he smashed a bunch of stuff before he was arrested. So a laptop, some sort of a gaming console. And there's concerns now that he was looking up all of these other things, including some racially charged events like the shooting in Buffalo. And he was making these comments that were racist and extremely violent on social media. But they haven't found all the potential documents that he may have been using or looking at that time. So I think the concern now is they have no idea what the actual universe of documents he may still have that may not have been found. But the reality is there's no evidence that he still would have access to classified information.
Courtney, here's what and I'm sure you don't have the answer, but it sounds like the Pentagon still doesn't know what he got.
Yes, I think that's absolutely fair.
They do not yet have figured out everything he downloaded. Yeah. How is it that there is not at least a cookie crumb trail now that they know who did it?
So, and it's not just what he downloaded, but remember, in one of these sort of chat rooms, he was just describing information. So it wasn't even necessarily the documents themselves. From the time this broke, it's been very clear that the entire universe of what he may have exposed here is unknown. And I have to say, several weeks into this now, it's clear that they are still looking, the U.S. government is still looking at what he may have had.
They think he was doing this longer than they first thought,
yes.
Correct?
Yes, and in more than one chat room, by the way, now.
And do we have any idea of motive other than impress his friends?
No, and you know, the impress his friends motive is, I think it's just one. The fact that now he was looking up these racially charged events and that he was talking about killing people, mass killings of people. You know, I think they're going to have to look at other potential options here for what he may have been doing and what his motivation was.
Any update on changing the process on who gets to be IT in the military?
No.
It's just random National Guardsmen in Massachusetts?
No, and remember, and we're also learning more about his background, including his time when he was in high school. And, you know, the Pentagon press secretary today was pressed on that. Are they looking at why some people, especially some younger people, you know, who don't have a long history that you can look at? It's still, if you're looking at someone's history for a classified document access over 10 years, but he's 19 or 20 years old.
When they first give him this access.
Yeah, so you're looking at a 10-year-old's record.
Why did any 19-year-old have access? I mean, look, we can have this debate about whether we should hand 19-year-olds guns to kill people, but we do in the military. I get that. But, you know, there's a lot of, why was, it seems like this is that there ought to be some experience level.
I don't get any sense that that's going to change based off of this. I do think that we'll see other things that will change. So more process changes that they will look at. I think there's going to have to be more aggressive monitoring of people while they're under the security clearance process as well, and then as well as something that looks a little bit deeper when they're actually going through the initial process.
Yeah, again, Hertz rental car has more, is tougher on 19 and 20-year-olds on whether they can rent a car than apparently the federal government with classified documents. Courtney Kube, thank you.
Thanks.
Let's turn now to the ongoing war in Ukraine. China is planning to send a special representative to Ukraine for talks about a political settlement. It comes after Chinese President Xi and Ukrainian President Zelensky held their first phone call since the beginning of the war. Xi had been saying he was going to call Zelensky, and he waited and waited and waited and waited. He finally did. Zelensky called the conversation long and meaningful, adding that no one wants peace more than the Ukrainian people. The White House says it welcomes the call between the two leaders, calling it a good thing, even as China is looking to expand its influence around the world. Ellison Barber is on the ground force in Kyiv right now. And Ellison, here's Zelensky. Anybody that says they want to have peace, he always embraces it. How much of it was public rhetoric, and how much of it were his comments serious?
Yeah, I mean, you look at where Russia and Ukraine are when it comes to even the concept of peace talks, right? Peace talks, they didn't make a whole lot of progress to begin with when they were being held. They have since stalled. But just from a big picture perspective, what Ukraine has consistently said is that they do not see a scenario for peace unless their 1991 borders are restored. When you look at the readout we have of this call between President Xi and President Zelensky, from President Zelensky's office, he mentions at least twice that they need to have those 1991 borders restored, and that includes Crimea. Russia, on the other hand, has pretty consistently said that if there were to be some sort of resolution to this war in negotiations, that they would want to see a scenario where, one, people acknowledge the annexation of Crimea that happened in 2014, and then also have countries and Ukraine acknowledge the territories that Russia annexed since they began the full-scale invasion. There are four of those: Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, as well as Zaporizhia. That's not something Ukrainian officials would ever agree to, particularly when it comes to those four that they have held these referendums since the full-scale invasion began. One thing that's been interesting just in the last little bit, and I'll reference some of our colleague Keir Simmons reporting here, is the envoy that China says they are going to send. It's someone by the name of Li Hui. According to Keir Simmons reporting, this is someone who spent decades working in Moscow in China's embassy there as the ambassador for a decade. Prior to that, having first and second secretary positions in the embassy. All of that, for Russian academics that Keir have spoken to, they say that means this is possibly a positive appointment for Moscow. We haven't heard from Ukrainian officials directly on that yet, but Chuck, we're already starting to see analysts and activists in Ukraine writing opinion pieces about that special envoy, saying because of his history working in Moscow, they're not sure he's someone they trust here at all, and they think China is sort of playing games. Again, that's opinion commentators, not the administration here in Ukraine just yet, but it maybe gives you a window in some of the issues that might still exist here.
Well, we know that in the United States, there's a ton of skepticism here about what the Chinese are up to. Anyway, Ellison Barber on the ground for us in Kyiv. Ellison, please stay safe. Coming up, we're going to talk a little debt ceiling, Disney and DeSantis. My one-on-one with Florida Republican lawmaker Byron Donalds is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning now to a couple of issues facing Republicans in Congress. The future of their party, future of the economy is on the docket. As we've noted early already, Republicans so far have largely rallied behind former President Trump as their choice in 2024 over Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Meanwhile, House Republicans yesterday rallied behind House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in his bill to raise the debt limit while trying to cut some spending, a mostly symbolic vote designed to at least get the White House to come to the negotiating table. So joining me now is one of the top Republicans in the House these days, who's got his, I think, ear and finger on the pulse of what's happening, Florida Republican Byron Donalds. Congressman, thank you for spending a few minutes with me here.
It's good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Let me start with, I don't want to get into the specifics of the debt ceiling because we know it's the beginning of a negotiation. But I'm curious about your trust in Kevin McCarthy. If Speaker McCarthy and President Biden strike a compromise, are you going to support that deal if Kevin McCarthy comes to you and says, look, it's not what you wanted, but it's as good as I was going to get considering the circumstances. You trusted me with this. Do you trust him enough to take whatever deal he cuts with Biden?
Well, Chuck, let's make sure we get this question absolutely right. What has Joe Biden ever negotiated that has actually worked out for the American people? I mean, you please tell me, because I've been observing his record up close for the last couple of years, and I've been observing politics for a long time. I mean, he's been here longer than I've been alive, not that long, but I've watched enough. He's never really negotiated anything that's worked out for the American people. The last Iran deal wasn't a good deal for us. He was part of those negotiations. And look at what his American Rescue Plan did. Massive inflation unleashed on the American people. Obviously didn't work out for any American. So let's start there. Number two, more importantly, when they get into a room, what Kevin McCarthy has in his pocket is a prescription for actually getting America back on track. It's something that takes us to pre-pandemic spending levels, something that 75% of Americans think we should be doing since, you know, the pandemic's over. So I want to actually see what happens before I bring in judgment on what my opinions are going to be. But I default to what has Joe Biden ever negotiated that's actually worked out.
Look, I'm not going to get into a political debate. I think a lot of people would make other arguments on his behalf, but I don't work for him. But I go back to the question, do you trust Kevin McCarthy on doing this negotiating or not?
Of course. I think he's going to do a good job for our conference in getting the best thing possible for the American people.
All right,
but hold on, real quick, Chuck.
Go ahead.
Let's not leave out Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer's been out there running his mouth, talking about how our plan was dead on arrival. But I'll ask you, Chuck, do you have 50 votes or 60 votes for a clean debt ceiling? The answer is no. You don't have those votes. If you had them, you would have brought it already. So I think it's time for Chuck Schumer, Kevin McCarthy, Joe Biden to get in a room, sit down, and figure out ways that we can actually responsibly take care of our spending and then also raise the debt ceiling, because the markets will tell you it's not just Congress's ability to raise the debt ceiling, it's Congress's ability to get their fiscal house in order in the short, intermediate, and long term.
Are you comfortable if a clean debt ceiling vote were put on the House floor? Because a clean debt ceiling vote probably would pass with a handful of Republicans and Democrats. Would you, if a majority of the House voted for a clean debt ceiling, what's wrong with that? Are you comfortable with seeing if that vote could happen?
No, I am not comfortable with that whatsoever. And the reason is very clear, very simple. We are running up debts faster than we'll have any ability in a very short while to ever pay them down. That imperils the United States economy long term. Look at what's happening around the globe. China is trying to negotiate around the U.S. dollar with other countries. They're trying to remove us from currency reserve status in the world. That's a major issue for our country. So why would a member of Congress, for any party, from any party for that matter, vote for a clean debt ceiling? When Joe Biden made that statement, it was just ridiculous, ignoring the fiscal and economic realities that we face as a nation.
I've seen some chatter that you may have your eyes on the governor's mansion perhaps in 2026. So let me ask you a question about Disney. How would you handle this Disney situation going forward?
Well, look, for me, I think the original hand slap that happened last legislative session, I thought was appropriate. Disney had stepped into some areas that, frankly, was none of their business. I know that people are allowed to comment, but it's not just about commenting on politics. They were trying to use their corporate weight, their corporate pressure against the state legislature and against the governor, and they, frankly, didn't read the law. So they messed around and played in a game that they had no business in. So I think, for me, that's where I would have left it, and I would have moved on. There are other machinations that are going on right now between Disney and the governor. We'll see where it lands.
So you think that there's a point where you don't necessarily use government to retaliate against a corporation?
Listen, you're talking to a member of Congress who is admonishing Democrats from trying to stop them from admonishing energy companies from spending money talking about climate change. And so that happened right here in Washington, D.C. I do not think that members of Congress or any state body should be wielding large amounts of political power against a entity. I don't believe that. But again, there's a lot of stuff that's been going on between Disney and between the governor, so we got to let this thing play out a little bit.
Look, the fact that you went ahead and endorsed Trump over DeSantis, and you're not alone in your delegation. What's your explanation of why the governor can't get Florida elected Republicans to rally around him?
I don't think it's that. Look, people in our state understand the type of governor Ron DeSantis has been. I've called him America's governor plenty of times because, let's just be very clear, he's the best in the country that's doing the job. But when it comes to hitting the ground running on day one, a lot of congressional Republicans, when we look at our economy, we look at the border, we look at foreign policy, which is a real problem in our country right now, we see very clearly that Donald Trump is the guy that can get the job done on day one. And for a lot of your viewers who might disagree with me in that assessment, I would say to them, we've seen Joe Biden, we've seen Donald Trump. Who did a better job? Period. End of story.
Donald Trump is floating, not participating in these Republican primary debates. He supposedly polled you and others at Mar-a-Lago, according to some reporting by Jonathan Martin. And a lot of you obviously were like, no, you should do the debates. But if he skips the debates, do you have a problem with that?
Look, he's going to make a decision. He's going to look at the facts and decide what's in his best interest. Me personally, I say go and debate. I like debating anyway. Obviously, I'm on your show.
Yes, you do.
I can do other things, so I like it. I enjoy it. It's fun. And I also think it's important to show the American people what your ideas are, what you view as the role that you're asking for going forward, and what you intend to do with it. Now, President Trump's been very clear about what his goals are. Just watch any video he puts out. He'll tell you directly. But I think he's stepped into the arena. I think he's going to do that. But of course, he likes to take input from everybody and get a full idea of what's going on before he makes his decision. You know, that's a good thing to do.
Congressman Byron Donalds, I have a lot more for you, but I'm running up against the clock here. I hope to talk to you soon again. Thanks for your time.
Sure, anytime.
You got it. Thank you all for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, NBC News Now. Coverage will continue here in a few seconds with Tom Costello, who is sitting in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.